Hello, everyone, and welcome to Mr. Martino's Ledger, a podcast all about the riveting and sometimes salacious history of accounting. I'm your co-host, Mackenzie I'm the CEO and co-founder of HashBasis, a crypto accounting firm, and I'm based here in San Francisco. And today's is going to be a very exciting episode. We're going to be talking about all about the history of accounting in ancient India.
And I'm Courtney Paul, co-founder of HashBasis, located in Nashville, and so excited for this episode.
Now, today's episode was difficult to research because I actually don't have much of a background in ancient Indian history. So, unlike Mesopotamia or Egypt, Greece, and certainly Rome, I've had a lot of exposure to those various cultures or places in time. I guess you could say a very westernized view of history. But I really did not get much education about India or specifically ancient India. I covered it in AP World History, I think sophomore year of high school. There was maybe one or two chapters, but beyond that, I was pretty clueless about this huge continent and these centuries of civilization. I know the basic facts like, okay, there's Hinduism, there's Buddhism, and I actually even had an Indian wedding, but at this point, it's more so culture and tradition. I didn't really know a lot about the backstory or the history. Now, my husband, Nikhil, he's Indian. He's actually born in India. And I asked him, I was like, hey, do you know anything about ancient India? Do you remember learning about it when you were going to school there? And he had no idea. So he wasn't actually much help. So I was basically starting from zero on this research. And it was so fascinating. I learned a lot. And so for this episode, we're actually going to be pretty heavy on just the history of ancient India in general. And so I'll cover that section. And then the second section is going to be more so on the history of accounting within ancient India. Now, India has a very sprawling history. There's rising and falling kingdoms, but there's actually a lot that we don't know because of the lack of records. We're going to talk about this more on the history of accounting side, but a lot of the records were written in palm leaves, which was the available medium for scribes back in these civilizations. But palm leaves do not really last that long. They do not stand the test of time, unlike pottery shards like in Egypt or certainly like the clay tablets in Mesopotamia. So we just are missing a lot of records. We do have some primary sources and texts that we can glean some history from. And just as a preview, the main source that we're going to be talking about today for the accounting history is called the Arthashastra by Kautilya. That's basically the one resource we have from ancient India about how accounting might have worked back then. So we're really going to dive deep into that. But first, we're going to review the history of ancient India. And I really wanted to go deep on this topic to give the audience more context because I'm kind of assuming that our audience has a more westernized knowledge or educational background similar to us. And so I really want to make sure that we do these civilizations justice before we get into talking about the accounting nitty gritty. So with that, let's get into the high level history of ancient India. Now, this is extremely high level. I'm sure there's a lot that we're maybe leaving out, but these are the main bullet points. So the first civilization is actually a bit mysterious. It's called the Indus River Valley civilization, and they existed from around 3300 to 1300 BCE. Now they had some famous cities that you might have heard of. They're called Harappa and Mohenjo-daro. And I say this is a mysterious civilization for a couple reasons. So the first reason is that we can't find any evidence of weapons within the civilization. And so historians have always been asking the question, was this a truly peaceful society? How come we can't find like a single spear or bow and arrow? Now, based on their ruins, we can also tell that they had remarkable urban planning that was very sophisticated and included works like bathhouses and drainage systems. So we usually associate those types of grand architectural projects with ancient Rome, but this society in ancient India had it thousands of years before the Romans did. Now, there's a really cool video that we're going to link in the show notes. It's called What Did Cities in Ancient India Look Like? And I think it's an AI generated rendering of what Mohenjo-daro or Harappa would have looked like. And it really does look like a classical era civilization, at least the architecture. So it's fascinating that this civilization seems to be so advanced, yet we don't really have that much information about them because they did not leave behind any records. Now, they're also a bit mysterious because they disappeared suddenly and nobody knows why. There's a couple of theories, such as there's an earthquake that altered the course of the Indus River. So their food supply dried up because they couldn't grow crops anymore. So that's more on the environmental side. And then the other theory that I saw out there is that they potentially were conquered by invaders since they were peaceful, they didn't have any weapons, they couldn't defend themselves. So maybe some other society or peoples came in and destroyed or dispersed them. So I think this civilization is really just so cool because of what we don't know about it. And I also thought it was just an interesting point that it seems like all big ancient civilizations were based around a river. In Mesopotamia, we had the Tigris and Euphrates River. In Egypt, we got the Nile River. And in India, we had the Indus River. So go figure, they needed the river for water to grow their crops. It was really a life source. Okay, that was a little blurb on the Indus River Valley civilization people that we don't know much about, except we know that they existed, don't know why they came into being or why they disappeared. Now, the next period is the Vedic period. And this is actually a very famous, important period. They existed from around 1500 to 500 BCE. The peoples that were living within the Vedic period are called the Indo-Aryans. And so that's a term that also might be familiar to you. These people migrated south from Central Asia into northern India around 1500 BCE. Now, I always thought the Indo-Aryans came from the Caucasus Mountains, so more so European, but it turns out not. They're coming from Central Asia. So that was a belief of mine that totally got dispelled when I was doing this research. Now, it's called the Vedic period because these people brought the Vedas, which are the oldest sacred text of Hinduism, and they were actually transmitted orally for centuries before actually being written down. Now, the Vedas were texts that I have not read, but I'm definitely familiar with the concept of them, and they infamously developed the caste system as well. This still exists in India and is a force within the society. And I mention this here because the caste system really informed how society developed and grew within ancient India. So, just real quick, a TLDR on the different categories within the caste system. So, the people at the top are called Brahmins, and this is the priestly class. Next is the Kshatriyas. These are the warriors who are protecting the people. They're second on the totem pole. After that, you have Vaishyas, which are merchants. And then below them is Shudras. These are the laborers, the farmers. And then there's actually a level below that. They're called the untouchables. And these people, it's actually really sad. They're marginalized from this system completely. If you're not part of the untouchable class, you can't talk to or associate with these people. So, yeah, that was developed in ancient times and it still kind of exists today. I think modern India doesn't emphasize the caste system so much, but for example, like my family, we were farmers. My husband's family, they're merchants. Like you still kind of know your caste, even though it seems really outdated to modern people. After the Vedic period, we had the age of Mahajanapadas. Hopefully, I got that pronunciation right. And these peoples existed from 600 to 321 BCE. Now, the Mahajanapadas are small kingdom states, and the most important one was called Magadha. The names aren't as important. The reason why I'm mentioning this age is that Buddhism happened to crop up or was invented during this time. And that was around 500 BCE that we get Buddhism. And also a separate religion called Jainism, which is still prominent in India today. Now, I'm going to go into a brief digression on Buddhism and the Buddha because this is such an apt time to be talking about this. I know my colleagues and my customers, they all know this, but I actually just got back from Vipassana, which is a 10-day silent meditation retreat and a course where you learn the technique of Vipassana. And Vipassana was a meditation technique that the Buddha actually taught. And so for 10 days, I was not talking to anyone, no eye contact, no input from the outside world. You couldn't talk to anybody, no technology, no phones. And you essentially meditate for 6 to 8 hours a day, even more if you're really hardcore about it. And for the rest of the time, you're either taking a walk, I'd walk for about 2 hours a day, eating meals, showering, things like that. And then at the end of the day, there'd be a discourse by Goenka, who was the meditation teacher that created these Vipassana centers. So I was very much steeped in the history of Buddhism and these meditation techniques. So it was actually really fascinating. I'm probably going to write a separate blog post about it. So be on the lookout for that. But we learned a lot about the actual Buddha. And so I wanted to just share a little bit about that because I thought it was just so interesting. Now, the Buddha, he was actually born as a prince, and his name was Siddhartha Gautama, and he's a prince from modern day Nepal. And yes, he's the guy that sat under a tree for a long time and became enlightened. His whole thing is that he codified the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. So just real quick, Four Noble Truths. Number one is life is suffering. So yeah, very optimistic. Number two is the cause of suffering is craving and aversion. Truth number three is you can free yourself from suffering and find nirvana, which is a state of enlightenment. And truth number four is that the way to do this is through the Eightfold Path, which is kind of like a code or a way to live a moral life and attain enlightenment. One thing that I didn't really realize until I took this course is that anyone can actually become a Buddha. There's not just one Buddha. It's not just Siddhartha Gautama. Like there's just one Jesus Christ. That's not how it really works in Buddhism. Anyone can really achieve this state of enlightenment and become a Buddha in their own right. Buddhism is interesting because it originated in India, again, modern day Nepal, so that region. But its influence today is more so in East Asian countries like Japan. Buddhism's really big there, same in China. And it faded from India since it went against the Hindu caste system because the caste system is very rigid, power based, and Buddhism upends that. It says you don't really need these castes, you just need to meditate, purify your mind, find enlightenment, and then you can just become a Buddha or an enlightened person. So obviously the Brahmins didn't really like this because they could lose their power because their power was given based on their birth, not through the hard work of purifying your mind. So anyway, just wanted to do a little bit of a side talk about that because it's just very relevant in my personal life right now. So that was the age of Mahajanapadas. Again, most important thing, Buddhism, Jainism. We can move on to the next part. The next part I'm super hyped about. So enter Alexander the Great. So now on our timeline, we're around 330 to 325 BCE. Alexander the Great is from Macedonia, which is a region above Greece. And so everybody's familiar with this guy. He conquered so many territories, including Greece, the Persian Empire, and his army walked all the way to the Indian subcontinent. And then from there, his troops, they were tired, they wanted to go back home, and so they started their trek back to Macedonia, and that's where, that's where he died. But it's really just so wild. He crossed the Indus River and advanced into Punjab, and that's when his troops revolted because they didn't want to. There was a really big empire or a really big army at that time in India, and his troops just thought they were outnumbered, and again, they were tired of marching continuously and they wanted to go home. Now, when he died in 323 BCE, he left a huge power vacuum in the regions that he touched. So that's why we have the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt. We had the Seleucid Empire more on the Persian side. And so that kicked off a whole other series of events and dynasties that we're not going to talk about now. But the important part for our discussion here is that he facilitated the introduction of Western art, philosophy, ideologies, etc., into the Eastern world. And on the other hand, Eastern ideas were now carried over via his army to the Western world. So I call this a huge cross cultural exchange. Now, in preparation for this podcast, I visited the Asian Art Museum in San Francisco. It's a really wonderful museum. They have so much just stunning artwork. And they had a whole section on Buddhist art, and I was so struck by how Hellenistic, which means how Greek and how Roman the statues of the Buddha looked. They looked like they came straight out of Greece and Rome, but they weren't, right? They were from regions in India and modern day Pakistan. And so you can definitely see the impact of this cross-cultural pollination, globalization going on. Also, real quick, a plug for my favorite history podcast. It's called Hardcore History by Dan Carlin. He's got some amazing episodes on Alexander the Great. I just listened to a couple of them before recording this episode. And he's also got one on Alexander's mother, who is super witchy and has just such a cool backstory. So I definitely recommend checking that out if you're into Alexander the Great lore. So that's just a brief blip in ancient Indian history, but a very important one. Now, the next part of Indian history that we're going to cover is the Mauryan Empire. And this one's really important for our purposes because that's where that accounting book that we mentioned, the Arthashastra, that's when this book was authored. It was during this period of time. So the Mauryan Empire was around from 322 to 185 BCE. And so shortly after Alexander got out of India, we have this guy. His name is Chandragupta Maurya. He was a young soldier from a low caste. He actually led a rebellion that drove out the remaining Greek forces, and he was the guy that actually established the Mauryan Empire. And this was the first major empire, at least organized administrative empire that ancient India had really seen. And it was big. It stretched from the Bay of Bengal, which is in the east, across northern India to the Hindu Kush Mountains, and then westward into modern day Afghanistan. And so I definitely recommend looking up a map of the Mauryan Empire because, at least based on what I can see, it extends beyond the borders of modern day India, again, into Pakistan, into Afghanistan. So it was pretty huge. And so again, as I mentioned, he united India under one rule for the first time ever, and the state was very advanced, very administrative, bureaucratic, and also very militaristic as well. Now, Chandragupta had a son, Bindusara. We'll talk about him later. He was okay. He was okay as a ruler. I think that's what most historians agree upon. But his grandson, Ashoka, he was actually the most famous ruler of the empire. So Ahsoka's hilarious. Maybe not hilarious, but so he was called Ahsoka the Cruel, but he went through this personal transformation where he became Ahsoka the Great. And I just think that's such a interesting transformation to happen to a ruler to a huge empire. So part one of Ahsoka's life, where he was known as Ahsoka the Cruel, he was called that because his soldiers massacred over 100,000 people, we think, in Kalinga, which is a region in eastern India, and this was in 261 BCE. So he killed a bunch of people, became Ahsoka the Cruel, but then after that, he was like, wow, what did I just do? He had a change of heart and he converted to Buddhism and he spent the rest of his life preaching nonviolence, compassion, and morality, essentially preaching Dhamma, which means the path to being enlightened. So this guy had a total 180. He was a military baddie and then I guess felt really guilty about killing hundreds of thousands of people and then became a bit of a guru. So I thought that was just okay, one of those things that you can only get through studying history. So eventually, as all empires do, the Mauryans declined and a bunch of smaller kingdoms took over. It was very fragmented, no longer this big centralized bureaucratic state. There's a lot more history here that I'm leaving out, but honestly, it's just a bit too much to get into. So the last empire that we're going to talk about is the Gupta Empire, not to be confused with Chandragupta, who was the first ruler of the Mauryan Empire. I know that's really confusing, but forget that. Now we're in the Gupta Empire. And this is called India's Golden Age or Classical India. So this is from 320 to 550 CE. So it spans a couple hundred years. And during this period of time, literature flourished. There was huge advancements made in science, math, astronomy, art, and architecture. Now, something I didn't know, which I thought was just the coolest fun fact, is that apparently Indian people invented the concept of zero and also the concept of decimals. I always thought that numbers came from the Arab world because we call it Arabic numerals, but actually numbers, like the numbers we use today, originated in India and then they were transmitted to Arabia, and then from there they were transmitted to Europe. So the lineage goes from we have our the Europe numbers, but they came from the Arabs who actually took them from the Hindus. So yeah, I thought that was just a really cool fun fact because I just never really knew that. Now, the civilization eventually declined, again, as all civilizations do, because they were invaded by the Huns. And it's so funny. In my show notes, I have a meme from Mulan, the let's get down to business to defeat the Huns. Well, not just the Chinese people that were scared of the Huns and that were affected by them, it was also the Gupta Empire, which declined because of them. Okay, so that's all we're going to talk about in terms of history. Just to recap real quickly, we had the Indus River Valley civilization, the Vedas, or the Vedic period, the Mahajanapadas, which is where Buddhism came into being. We had a brief intermission by Alexander the Great just doing his thing. Then we had the Mauryan Empire, which is where we get the Arthashastra, which we're going to talk about right now. And then we have the Gupta Empire, which is the Golden Age. So I'm going to take a breather right there. Courtney, any thoughts, questions? What do you think about all of this? It's a lot, I know.
It's very fascinating. I loved the YouTube video. I think you referenced it earlier in the when you were going through the history, but the YouTube video that showed what an ancient Indian civilization would look like and how sophisticated it was, and to see, I guess, how it transpired into modern day India. I have very little background knowledge of ancient Indian history, so everything that you just spilled out was, like you already mentioned, it was fascinating, especially about the numbers and the decimals. Yeah, just going way back, I had no clue. I learned a lot, to say the least, this episode.
Yeah, I was joking with Nikhil. I was like, "No wonder why you're so good at math, honey. Like, your people invented this, or I should say our people, but it runs deep in your blood. That's why you can do mental math so quickly." So yeah, definitely a learning opportunity for me too, as well. All right. So now that we have the history out of the way, and hopefully you have a greater understanding and appreciation for this, not just one civilization, but a whole host of civilizations. Now we're going to talk about what accounting looked like during this time period. Unfortunately, we do not have much evidence about what accounting in India looked like before the Mauryan Empire. So we have something, so there are mentions of words like sale and merchant and price in the Vedas, but we don't have direct evidence of a formal accounting system. And we also don't really have primary source accounting documents, like actual accounting records listing out transactions and goods and people's names, like we had in Mesopotamia and Egypt. As I mentioned, in Mesopotamia, we had clay tablets, we had cuneiform. In Egypt, we had papyrus and ostraca and the hieratic script. But records in India were written on palm leaves, which do not last thousands of years. So, yeah, it's actually super unfortunate that we don't have more information to go on. And I was really just hankering for some kind of ancient primary source, like some ledger book or something that I could look at least based on Perplexity, which again we use them to research this episode, I could not find anything. Most of the actual Indian accounting records we get from the colonial age. I'm talking like British colonialism, like in the 1800s and 1900s.
For as sophisticated as their cities were developed and constructed, I was completely taken back by the fact that they used palm leaves for documentation or references. That was just mind blowing to me.
Yeah, same here. Unfortunately, not a lot to go off of there, but we do have beacon of hope. We do have the Arthashastra, which I've mentioned several times, and this is a comprehensive book in Sanskrit on statecraft, economics, and military strategy. And there's a tiny little chapter about accounting as well, and so that's what we're going to spend this time talking about. It's written by a guy named Kautilya around the 4th to 3rd century BCE. And it was actually rediscovered in 1905. So it's relatively new-ish information to modern audiences. And it's kind of like an advice book for kings. And the comparable that's always mentioned with it is The Prince by Machiavelli. But keep in mind, Machiavelli, who was part of the Italian Renaissance, he lived 752 years after Kautilya. So really, Kautilya was the OG Machiavelli. He did it first. And based on what I can see, he was way more powerful and insightful than Machiavelli was. I did read The Prince back in high school, which I think a lot of people did. It was just like a phase I think a lot of people went through. So we're going to spend some time talking about Kautilya's life and his legacy because this dude was just, he was so OP. Like, he was awesome. So we call him Kautilya, but he also had another name called Chanakya. And the translation of this is broken teeth. Apparently, he had broken teeth. I don't know if that's helpful or not, but I thought that was a fun tidbit to come down to us through the ages. And he was actually instrumental in the overthrow of the dynasty before the Mauryans. This was called the Nanda dynasty. And he was so key in establishing the Mauryan Empire. So before the Mauryans, I mentioned there was all these smaller kingdom states, and the one right before was called the Nandas. And so he was actually insulted in the Nanda court. Their capital was called Pataliputra. So apparently he went to Pataliputra, was in this court that was the Nanda kings, and he was insulted there for whatever reason. I forget the exact reason. But after he was insulted, he swore to take down the empire. He was like, they have injured me so, and so I'm just going to take down this whole political regime. And the crazy thing is, he actually did it. He wasn't a king himself. He wasn't born into this really powerful, wealthy family. He was just like an accountant, bookkeeper type of guy. But he was able to do a lot and left a huge legacy. So the legend is that he discovered a very young Chandragupta Maurya in the forest. It turns out Chandragupta was a distant descendant of previous kings. Now, I don't know if this is true. This very well might be just part of the lore of the empire, but I think it's really fun to think about this accountant with broken teeth going into the forest and then just finding this descendant of the kings and being like, okay, you're going to be my guy. So Kautilya staged a coup against the Nandas and Pataliputra, again, the main capital of that kingdom. And initially it failed at first. So he, yeah, did not succeed at first. But then he retreated, he regrouped, gathered more forces, and he actually forged alliances with some powerful neighbor kings in the area. And he actually tried again. And it turns out the second time he was successful. So he failed, learned, got more information, tried again, and then was successful. So I think that's just a really powerful lesson for anyone in life who's trying to do anything. If at first you don't succeed, try again. At least that's what my mom always told me. And so he became the advisor to Chandragupta because he was the one who pretty much installed him on the throne. And he was also an advisor to Chandragupta's son called Bindusara. And Kautilya was really the guy who created this large, stable, centralized administration, and he united the majority of India under one empire. So even though the name Chandragupta is the one that we think of and we associate it with the Mauryans, it looks like there was somebody very smart and powerful behind the scenes who was really pulling the strings. Real quick, I did want to do a quick digression on Bindusara, who is the son of Chandragupta, because there's just a really funny story that I came across on YouTube, actually. We'll also link that video. So apparently, Kautilya was very paranoid, and so he always would put small amounts of poison in Chandragupta's food to build up his tolerance, which reminded me of Wesley from The Princess Bride. So anyway, that's where my mind went. But one day, Chandragupta's pregnant wife accidentally ate his slightly poisoned food, and she actually died from the poisoning. But for some miraculous reason, they were able to cut out her baby in time. And this baby, who was Chandragupta's son, Bindusara, he was saved in time and he got his name because his body was marked by a drop of his mother's blood. Remember, the poison blood. And so Bindusara, when you translate it, it means the strength of the drop, which I think is just such a badass translation of your name. And just, I don't even know if the story is real or not. Again, it could be one of those, the lores coming down from history, but wow, if it's true, man, I feel bad for his wife. Not only did she die by poisoning, but her baby was cut out of her. So anyway, that was a bit gruesome, but that just tells you about the kind of guy that Kautilya was. He built up his king and also his son at the same time. So, okay, with that though, let's actually get into the Arthashastra. And as I mentioned, this book is the how-to for ancient politics and topics like statecraft, economics, military warfare, etc. But no one really talks about how the book also somewhat codifies early accounting principles. There's actually a ton of YouTube videos about the Arthashastra. It's a lot of, like, Indian professors at universities talking about it, so I think it's probably recommended reading in political science 101 or something at these schools, and no one talks about the accounting, so we have to actually go and read these chapters in the book, so we're gonna give you all this information that we learned. Now, the book was rediscovered in 1905, and just real quick, another digression. There's actually been a lot of drama with this original manuscript that was rediscovered. And so it was a palm leaf, and so it's actually miraculous that we still have a copy of this palm leaf, which, as we know, is not a very sturdy or long-lasting material. And it was discovered amongst a heap of documents that were owned by this Brahmin, and they were donated to the Mysore Oriental Library. And as we know, it's about 400 to 500 years old. And there's just a lot of drama because it sounds like it wasn't really being taken care of that well. But because of this drama that was created on social media, it's now in a much better condition. So, in case you're worried about this original manuscript, don't worry, it's in much better state. And actually, I saw this article from, let me open it up. It's some Indian newspaper. It looks like Modi, like the Prime Minister Modi. There's a picture of him looking at it from a couple of months ago. So I think it's okay now. We won't lose this book to the sands of time. But anyway, there's 15 chapters within this book, and book 2 and book 5 mention accounting topics. Now, for this podcast, we're just going to look at book 2 because there's already a lot of information to cover just with this book. But there's also a ton of other chapters in this book, and accounting was definitely not the main focus. A couple of other chapters that I thought were just so ancient. It's not anything that people would write about today. The first one I have is was a chapter called "The Superintendent of Prostitutes." That was somebody's actual job. Another chapter was "Training of Elephants," and specifically, it talks about more like farm elephants, but then also wartime elephants. And then lastly, "The Conduct of Spies." Kautilya was really into using spies. He strongly believed that they were the ultimate defense against having your empire fall. Like, you need eyes and ears in every corner of the empire, so you know when someone's about to stab your back or have a coup. And there's actually a quote from this Conduct of Spies chapter that I want to read you because it's just, again, so wild. It's something that's so ancient and it's so unrelatable, but honestly so entertaining. So it goes, quote, "Harlots or a dancing woman or a songstress may make an appointment to meet a lover in some secret house. And when the lover comes to the house with the desire of meeting her there, fiery spies may kill him or carry him off, bound in chains." End quote. And so it was so funny because so many of these spy scenarios involve women, like women tempting men and then them being taken off by some other spy. So I thought that was just kind of funny. And then the last chapter that I wanted to mention was strategic means to capture a fortress. So there is a lot of information in here about warfare, and this is all coming from Kautilya's practical experience. Remember, he tried to stage a coup against the Nandes. He failed and had to try again. So this guy actually has a lot of practical experience, unlike Machiavelli. So yeah, as I said, this guy really is the OG. I think Machiavelli really just does not compare to Kautilya, but unfortunately, because of the way of like westernized education, we really just learn more so about Machiavelli. I had no clue about this Kautilya guy before researching this episode. All right, now the way we're structuring this is that we're gonna go by book and by chapter, like the chapters that mention accounting topics, and we're just gonna review what is said within them, and then we're gonna have some discussion questions as well. We're gonna start with book two, chapter six, and the title of this chapter is "The Business of Collection of Revenue by the Collector General." The Collector General sounds like it was some type of job or office title. And the book starts by getting into what are the different revenue sources for the empire. And I love the translation. It calls it the mouth from which income is to issue. So essentially, how is revenue being generated? And there's a couple of different ways. So first one is called capital, and this is the money from selling state-owned goods or assets. The next is called share, and this is the king's share of output. And it looks like there was a standard 1/6 agricultural land tax. And so this sounds like tax revenue. Next is called premia, which is sales tax charged on commercial dealings, so very similar to what we have today. After that, we have fixed taxes, such as those at tolls, ports, ferries, or riverbanks. And then after that, we have fixed fines, so standardized monetary penalties imposed for certain offenses. And yes, there were offenses or penalties if you did not do your accounting correctly. So that's revenue. Now, the book also talks about what are the types of expenses or expenditures that are involved in running an empire. And it's broken down to two categories. The first one is daily expenditures, and these are ongoing costs. For example, the cost to maintain the kitchen, the storehouses, the armory, the harem, the granary, all those types of things that you would expect to have some kind of cost every day. Next is called profitable expenditure, and I was a little bit confused about this one, but it sounds like these are capital investments. So let's say you spend a bunch of money, but you're acquiring some kind of fixed asset, then that's called a capital investment. Now, after that, we have the net balance, which is just the revenue minus expenditures. And so that's a concept that's very familiar to us today. And it actually does sound like there was the concept of receivables or items that are revenue, but you haven't actually realized it yet. The next section we're going to talk about is the three types of receipts. And I realize this is confusing, but I think there's revenue sources, but then there's different ways that you can receive this revenue. And the book calls them receipts. Now, the three types of ways you can receive this revenue, one is current, and so that's money that's received day after day, and that's considered recurring revenue. And so those are things like the taxes, the fines, the fees. The next type of receipt is the lost balance, and this is brought forward from prior periods. So this is revenue that is still held by other people, or you don't actually have custody of it yourself. And so this reminds me of an opening balance, almost like an opening accounts receivable balance. Like it is your revenue, but you don't actually have it yet. And then the last type of receipt is they call it an accidental receipt. And so this includes items like lost and forgotten items that were recently recovered, fines levied on government servants, any treasure troves that are discovered. So, again, a very ancient source of income that's not really something we have today. And then there's just another bucket, ancient other income. For example, the property of those who have fallen victims to epidemics and they don't have any related family that can take over their property. That kind of reminds me of today we have other income and other expense. That's a line item that goes below all the operating expenses, but it's still part of your business. So they had the same concepts back then. They're also very specific with how they record the time. So, for example, there's the royal year, the month, the fortnight, which is called paksha in their language, the day, and the dawn. Now, certain fortnights within seasons, for example, there's the rainy season, winter, summer, they're treated as special administrative cutoff points, and they actually recognize an extra month to keep the lunar calendar as lined with the solar year. So they were very much into tracking transactions very specifically and getting it right down to the day.
I can't help but feel that everything that you just mentioned about Kautilya, carefully classifying revenues and expenses, and then also talking or touching on the timeframes, it seems to very much mirror how we set up a chart of accounts for a client or how we do reconciliations. Do you see a correlation between the two in setting up a chart of accounts for certain revenues, certain expenditures, but then also the reconciliations that we do, whether it be monthly, quarterly, end of year?
That's a great point. It does sound like they have some sort of ancient proto chart of accounts because they're not just lumping everything into one revenue bucket or one expense bucket. They're breaking it down. And again, they have these concepts like capex, they have net income as a concept, and then also the other expense, other income. So, it's really such a shame that we don't have any primary source documents or ledgers because then we'd be able to tell exactly what it looked like, but, we don't really have that, but I do think they had some sort of chart of accounts that's similar to what we have today. And now the next chapter, which is in book 2, is chapter 7. It's called The Business of Keeping Up Accounts and the Office of Accountants. What's pretty different about this chapter is that it opens with how to orient or how to design the accountant's office. So it reminded me of a guide for office managers. It literally tells you how to set up your accountant's office in terms of like spatially how to do it. For example, the door has to face north or east, and these are considered auspicious directions in Hindu cosmology. Just a footnote on that, Hindus are very superstitious, and things have to be or astrologically auspicious when you do certain things. For example, for our wedding, it had to be on a very auspicious day and time. We couldn't do any other day, or else it just was not favored by the Hindu gods. So it's so funny that I had a very practical and relevant example of that in my own life. And then Kautilya is talking about this in terms of the accountant's office thousands of years ago. Now, also the clerks' seats, so the accountants where they sat were kept apart. I guess they couldn't talk to each other. And then the account books were arranged on shelves in prescribed order. So it sounds like Kautilya wanted things to be very neat. And they're called clerks in the translation that we have, but I think these are just scribes. And I looked it up, and it sounds like scribes are also very prestigious or is considered a very prestigious profession even back in ancient India. I could not find a lot of primary sources talking about scribes, unlike what we had in ancient Egypt, but my understanding is that clerks are equal to scribes or equal to what we would call accountants today. Now, these accountants were responsible for recording a large variety of data, and we actually have the different buckets that they were responsible for. The first one is operational data. So, for example, the number of departments within the administration, the description of what these departments were working on, and then the profit and loss figures for each department. Next is goods and commodities. So, essentially, just inventory management. And they have a very specific example. You have to record the rates of the prices for gems. It looks like the ancient Indians were super into gems and rare stones and recording them, and also recording other commodities that were either of superior or inferior value, and also weights and measures. Next is gifts and patronages. So any gifts to the king's courtiers, those had to be recorded, titles to land, taxes, provisions, and salaries paid for people within like the royal administration. And think of this as expense tracking for executive benefits because they also had to track gains to the king's wives and sons. And also, I think the harems as well. So I consider this royal family accounting and inventory. So it wasn't just numbers they had to record. It sounds like they had to record any type of transaction. And again, since we don't have primary sources, can't really say for sure, but it does sound like this is more narrative single entry accounting, like what we saw in Egypt. It wasn't like the very sparse ledgers that we have today. Their accounting year was June through July, so they did not operate on a calendar year like most companies do today. They were actually June through July. And there were several fines if you got your accounting wrong. There's a whole section or several pages on the fines an accountant has to pay if they messed up the numbers or submitted ledgers late or were involved in some kind of fraud or embezzlement scheme. So Kautilya was also very strict on that. The books had to be done correctly by the time that they were due. And I actually have a quote about this that I wanted to read everyone because it not only talks about the fines, but also spies, because again, Kautilya loves spies. So he wrote, quote, a government officer not caring to know the information gathered by espionage and neglecting to supervise the work in his own department as regulated may occasion loss of revenue to the government owing to his ignorance or by making use of false balance, false measures, and false calculation owing to greediness. Kautilya says that the fine shall be proportional to his guilt. So, whatever that might be, it sounds like the fines were proportional or calculated in relation to the severity of the offense that was committed.
So Kautilya used fines and harsh penalties, and today we have regulation or reputational risk, things of that sort, legal action. Do you think one way, Kautilya's way or the current way with regulation, is better in blockchain crypto space?
I'm laughing because imagine if accountants today, if they got their entries wrong, but they personally had to pay the company back or pay the government back, no one would ever want to be an accountant. So it sounds like in ancient India, they did not have the idea of limited liability. There was no LLCs or anything like that. If you messed up, you personally were liable. And so now I think that system probably led to better results just because the penalties were a lot harsher and you would feel the pain personally. But at the same time, I probably would not want to work under that system. But the other thing I will mention is that today we have insurance. Like if Hashbasis messes up, theoretically, if company could sue us, but we do have insurance to recoup that loss. I doubt the concept of personal accounting insurance existed for these government clerks. So yeah, it's different system, but to some pretty good results.
Agree with you. I like that point. I think the scarcity in the accounting field would be far scarce if that were the case today.
Yes, exactly. Now, there was more than just fines if you didn't do your work correctly. Kautilya also had sophisticated audit and verification rules, or he had a whole system on how to make sure the numbers were actually correct. And he didn't just use fines as a way to ensure accuracy. So, a couple of different frameworks that he wrote about. First one is time based verification. So, it sounds like the numbers were checked not only every day, but they were checked every 5 days, every fortnight, every month, every 4 months, and then every year. And they were tied, cross tied to make sure that the total still matched up. And so, someone couldn't go in and change the date to a prior date for a particular entry and hope that would slide because the numbers were consistently being checked. And so that's something that we do today. We're not just closing the books for the month and then forgetting about them. We're continuously reconciling not only every month, but every quarter and certainly every year. And so today it's, I think, much harder to at least perpetrate this kind of fraud where you just change the date. So back then, yeah, transactions are time stamped and verified across multiple horizons. The next verification framework is receipt verification. So this is for inflows or revenue coming in. There was a variety of metrics that had to be recorded. For example, the place and time of collection, the form of collection. So what good was actually received? Was it gems? Was it grain? What exactly was it? Who paid it? Who caused the payment? The officer who fixed the amount and the officer who received it. So this reminded me actually of what we discussed in ancient Egypt when goods were being, or let's say grain was being transported from the farmer all the way to the storehouse. Every chain in this line of transportation was recorded. And it sounds like it was the same thing back in the Arthashastra, like back in Kautilya times. Every single person or good that was involved in this had to be written down to decrease the chances of fraud. Now, the same thing happened on the expense verification side. So you had to record the time and place the expense was paid, who ordered the expense, who paid it, who delivered it, who received it, the cause of the expenditure, and the amount payable versus the amount paid. So you could actually record what they still owed you if they did not pay the full amount. The last verification technique is called the arithmetical processes. And so, of course, when the clerks were writing all this information, they were using addition and subtraction. But it sounds like they were also doing it's called inference in the book, but it really sounded like early analytics just to make sure that the numbers actually made sense, like a gut check. And this again reminded me of ancient Egypt, where the scribes would go and they would do an estimate of the amount of taxes that were expected to be received based on the quality of the harvest. And then they would compare that against the amount of taxes actually received. So for them, they could do this comparison. And if it was wildly different, they could look into and see why. So it looks like Kautilya's accountants were basically doing the same thing. So early analytics. Now, in addition to these mathematical analytics, espionage was part of this verification process. So again, Kautilya was super into using spies. They were the eyes and the ears of the king. There's actually a whole chapter. It's titled The Institution of Spies. And so you were supposed to use spies to detect any fraud or any schemes that could be happening that weren't like automatically detected via these mathematical processes. Now that's the number verification framework. There also was some what we would call audit techniques. So accountants from different districts brought their books to like the main center, but their books were sealed. And the accountants were also kept apart so they couldn't talk to each other and they had to report the totals in their books independently. And then only then the results were compared. So you couldn't change your numbers based on what some other accountant said or cook the books or collusion. Like these measures were in place to prevent collusion between different accountants. So this is audit. This is pretty much what we have today, but they were already doing this 2,300 years ago. But again, there's strict measures if you don't do your job correctly, and especially if you are perpetrating fraud, collusion. I have a quote here that I want to read you. Quote, when an officer does not facilitate or prevents the execution of the king's orders or renders the receipts and expenditure otherwise than prescribed, he shall be punished with the first amercement. Now, just real quick, I will explain what the first immersement means because I was personally confused about this. And there were different levels to fines, and fines were just called immersements. I think it's just the translation we have. They're using Old English or a different word. So there's different levels of fines. The first level is defined as a fine of about 48 to 96 panyas. Panyas were a standardized coin and unit of money used during the Mauryan Empire. And you can think of it like a silver or a copper coin. So the Mauryans did have currency, much like today's currency. And this is actually a big difference compared to what we saw in ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia. They did not have coinage like we have today. They had goods, right? They were bartering and trading in grain or in beer or cattle. And these societies had units of measures like the deben, but it wasn't actually a physical coin that represented some value. The Mauryans did have that. So that's something that I really wish we had more detail about. And again, examples because we could see how they recorded these transactions when it wasn't cattle, it was an actual coin that they were discussing. So that was a really cool thing to discover during our research was that even in these ancient times, they had coins, they had money. So this is definitely a level up in terms of world civilizations. The Indians were definitely very advanced. All right, now the next chapter we have is chapter 8, and this is called Detection of What is Embezzled by Government Servants Out of State Revenue. So this is the anti-fraud, anti-embezzlement chapter, and Kautilya, as you know, is super anti-fraud. The first line in this chapter says, quote, all undertakings depend upon finance. Hence, foremost attention shall be paid to the treasury. So Kautilya was no dummy. He knew that everything settles or comes down to money. And so it's really important that people are not skimming off the top or doing anything else that's sketchy. This chapter is kind of long, but it basically lists out a bunch of frauds and their related fines. And there's actually a specific section about 40 ways of embezzlement. That's the title of the subchapter. Don't worry, we're not going to read out all 40 frauds, but I did want to read to you some of my favorite frauds because some of them are just funny and some of them are very relevant to today. So I think I have three frauds that I'm going to read direct quotes from the book. So the first one is, whoever makes as unripe the ripe time or as ripe the unripe time a revenue collection is guilty of fabrication. Herein, a fine of 10 times the amount shall be imposed. So he's saying that if you change the date of revenue collection, either by moving the date up or back to manipulate revenue, you are going to be fined. And it looks like this type of trick would be caught because of the way they're doing time based number verification. The next fraud says, whoever enjoys himself with whatever belongs to the king is guilty of self enjoyment. Herein, death sentence shall be passed for enjoying gems, middlemost amercement for enjoying valuable articles, and restoration of the articles, together with a fine equal to their value, shall be the punishment for enjoying articles of inferior value. So I guess if you steal gems from the king, you die, but if you steal anything else, you just have to pay a fine. So again, this underscores the importance of gems for some reason to the Mauryans. Now, the last fine or the last fraud we're going to talk about is a quote from the excerpt of like the 40 ways of embezzlement. So we're just going to read the first couple of lines here. Quote, there are about 40 ways of embezzlement. What is realized earlier is entered later on. What is realized later is entered earlier. What ought to be realized is not realized. What is hard to realize is shown as realized. What is collected is shown as not collected. What has not been collected is shown as collected. So just imagine these types of riddles go on for another page. He also talks about collusion. He says, quote, when in concert, they eat up the revenue, which means if people work together for nefarious reasons, they just eat up or skim off the revenue that really belongs to the king. And so when there is some type of fraud or collusion, all people involved or potentially involved are examined. So, for example, the treasurer, the receiver, the payer, the clerk that's recording all these transactions, everyone is examined. And what I thought was really prescient is that early on, they did have a concept of whistleblowers and whistleblower laws, rules, and protections. The book says, quote, any informant who supplies information about embezzlement under perpetration shall, if he succeeds in proving it, get as reward 1/6 of the amount in question. But if he happens to be a government servant, he shall get only 1/8 of the amount in question. When the charge is proved, the informant may impute the tale bearing to someone else or clear himself in any other way from the blame. Any informant who withdraws his assertion, prevailed upon by the insinuations of the accused, shall be condemned to death. So, just to break this down a little bit, that first section means that if you whistleblow and you're proven right, you can actually get some reward for it. But if you're a government worker and you're also the whistleblower, you get a little bit less of a reward. And the second one says that if you're correct as the whistleblower, you can actually say, oh, somebody else said this to protect yourself so that there's no backlash, but you can't recant what you said. You can't say, oh, actually, I said this, but I actually meant another thing. Let's say that you were bullied or intimidated by the accused person. You can't go back on what you said or else you die. So it's actually a pretty harsh punishment and pretty strict if you change what you said about the fraud that's going on. So yeah, Kautilya was very much into telling the truth and making sure that nothing was stolen from the administration and ultimately from the king. And Courtney, I think you had some discussion topics, especially around fraud. I know that always seems to come up on these episodes.
So solely a hypothetical question, but I can't help but feel like there's some correlation between Kautilya's ways of discovering fraud and his processes used to today's tooling that we use. And what I'm referencing is block explorers. So again, solely hypothetical question, but I'm curious on how you think or what you think Kautilya would feel about present day block explorers and using them to gather data that's time stamped, relevant, all of those things. I think like I feel like there's a correlation there. It just is the volume is vastly different if I'm envisioning correctly, but curious to hear your thoughts about it.
That's such a fun question. And I do think, first of all, he'd be very impressed. I think he'd really love that you can just enter in any hash because there's a unique identifier for every transaction. They definitely did not have this back in ancient India. They just had ledgers on palm leaves. And so I think he really liked that everything was tied to a unique identifier and also it was time stamped. So the timestamps on the Block Explorer are not going to change. It's on the blockchain forever at that time, immutable for anybody to see. So I think he really would appreciate that aspect of this technology. But on the other hand, you and I have definitely both seen examples of when block explorers have failed us. So for example, remember like early Solana data, like early Sol data, like when it first launched, is just missing from block explorers. Maybe it's not the case now, but I remember when we were first doing our early Solana Rex, we could not get the first couple epochs worth of commission. That was just missing. So I think data completeness is definitely an issue with these explorers, especially if they're built by teams that are not legit or we don't really know. It's like not the foundation, it's some like random developer somewhere. And also, whenever blockchains upgrade, sometimes the block explorer just totally drops the earlier versions of the chain data. And so you have to already know someone with a node somewhere that has a copy of the historical data. So block explorers definitely have their faults. Data can just either not appear in the first place or it can just totally disappear. And so I don't think Kautilya would be very happy with that because that kind of wrecks his time-based verification. If you were to check by years, let's say, or even if there was a blockchain upgrade within the year, you couldn't fully rec out or reconcile 1 year's worth of data on the block explorer if a portion of that data is missing. So does that make sense? I don't know. Do you think Kautilya would just be blown away by block explorers?
I think the overwhelming amount of data available, yes, I think would be blown away. I think to your point, bringing up the fact that you don't always know where the data is coming from, who developed the Block Explorer, what team, what anon. So I think that was a key point that you added there as well. And I think Kautilya would lean the opposite of that, more concrete sort of data. That's how I feel.
Yeah, I agree. I wish we knew. And I wish we just had some dang early records to look at here to add some more color to the story. But yeah, I definitely would recommend reading at least some other chapters of the Arthashastra because, as I said, like the accounting portions are so small, and it's very easy to see that they're not the main point of the book at all. I think the chapters on spies, I did read a little bit of that. That was a lot more interesting. And the warfare chapters, I also am curious to glimpse at those too, because it seems Kautilya really had it. It seemed like this guy was very sharp and he had it figured out because he had been around the block, for decades. Okay, so we're gonna wrap this up because that was a lot. And just to confirm, I think I said it earlier, ancient India had a single entry accounting system like the other early civilizations. They didn't really have the sophisticated double entry that we have today. Now, that being said, when I was doing research, it seemed like double entry was still developed much earlier in India than in Italy or even in any Western country, because India has this system of accounting called the Bahi Kata system. And unfortunately, a lot of what I found on the internet is in Hindi, so I've not had the chance to translate it yet. And it's so nebulous and ethereal and just really complicated to understand what exactly Bahikata is. But it seems like it's a very early double entry system that India had. It's a can of worms, so I think I'm going to do a separate episode on it. But I think the groundwork for Bahikata was laid during the Arthashastra and Kautilya time, but I don't think it fully developed until more so the Middle Ages, Renaissance time. And so, yeah, it turns out the Bahikata is still kind of used in India today, especially by small shops and small business owners. And there actually is an app called Kata Book, which is where you can do accounting under this Bahikata system. I actually downloaded it, but again, I don't really understand how the system works. I just know that it's double entry, but it's different to the double entry we have today. So I just wanted to tease that because I think we are going to chat about it. I'm just running into some research blocks because of the language barrier. But anyway, let's get back to what did we learn from the Mauryans because they were a very sophisticated civilization. They had comprehensive record keeping. It looks like they recorded everything and you had to categorize it correctly. There was independent verification that we talked about, like the time-based verification. There was separation of duties. So, for example, more so audit techniques. It was never the same person doing everything. It looks like processes were definitely duplicated, or we had multiple people doing and checking various processes. Cross checks across the time periods that we discussed. So their systems do seem very advanced. It's just that we don't really have a primary source document to confirm that. And of course, the incentive alignment structure was very well developed. If you increased revenue, you were actually rewarded. There is a section in the Arthashastra about that. But if you perpetrated fraud or just were bad at your job, if you were incompetent and caused a loss to revenue, you had to pay fines for that as well. And fraud was also penalized proportionally. There was not one size fits all penalty. It looks like the penalty really depended on the severity of it, which shows a degree of nuance and a degree of understanding, not only of accounting, but also human behavior as well. So overall, the accounting tradition has very deep roots in ancient India that extend to the modern day, i.e., the Bahi Kata system that we have not figured out yet. And I can confidently say that Kautilya was more OG than Machiavelli when it comes to stunning statecraft and accounting. So yeah, I hope you all enjoyed this episode. Courtney, I think you had a couple of other closing thoughts here that I'd love to talk about too.
Yeah, so what I just couldn't help but feel like there's a lot of correlation between this civilization, ancient India, and what we do today. Like, though vastly different time frames, I just feel like there's a lot that we mirror today to what they did back then, such as the segregation of duties, the comprehensive data record keeping, the audit trails, things of that sort, the penalties, the fines, the regulations. Though different, still similar and can be correlated, I guess. So I really enjoyed that this episode and all the ancient history, Indian history that you shared, because I feel like obviously I knew very little about it going into it, but I learned so much, but also feel like I have a new appreciation for how it all comes together and how I see what I do in everyday life compared to what they did back then. So I found it very fascinating. I really enjoyed this episode.
Definitely a lot of continuity between then and now. And you just wait until our history of accounting in ancient China episode because I really don't know anything about Chinese history either. So, yeah, that is going to be the next episode that we are going to research and release. And I expect that we're going to have quite the journey with that civilization as well. So, thank you everyone for tuning in. And I hope you all have a wonderful day. Thank you.